was an early 20th century Anglican priest named William Temple, who said once, if people have a wrong view of God, the more religious they become, the worse they become. And when I first heard that quote, it quite honestly shook me to the core because it kind of encapsulated a personal journey that I had been on, sort of rediscovering the Father's love for people. And, I had started reading. I grew up in a church and in a great church, but more recently, I just started reading these older theologians, dead theologians and pastors, people I kind of thought would be more the Bible thumpers, and they'd only be talking about hellfire and brimstone and stuff like that. And I discovered this beauty of the way that they talked about the love of God and the love of Christ. And where, honestly, I felt a little, it felt like it was too good to be true. I'm reading these books and I'm kind of looking around, hopefully nobody's watching me. This feels, is anybody looking? I was almost nervous to believe it. Nervous to believe how good really this God is. And it blew my mind because, for so long, I think my view of God was sort of uncomfortable with this lovingness. I knew he was loving in theory, but I pictured his love more as a dad that loves you, but you never experienced that love. He provided the house for you and you're, paid for your food and all those things which are important, but he never enjoyed you. You never experienced his love. And so I had just been kind of trying to rewire my brain of what I think was a more biblically, theologically sound view of who God was. Because my assumptions was he's more, trigger happy. You kind of walk on eggshells around him, right? Some of you are smirking because maybe you relate. He loves us, but in a stoic kind of love that's not experienced but just told. And this quote just encapsulated that. When our assumptions of him are wrong, it can actually do more damage than good. Because the more we grow towards that image of who we think he is, the better or worse we can become. So if our view of God is so tainted, then the more, as he's saying, the more religious we become, the worse we become. The further away from a biblical, loving view of God we grow into. And so that's why our view of God is so important. Our theology of God is so important. And we all have a theology of God. We all do. Theology is just made up of two Greek words, theos, which just means God, and logos, which means words or thoughts. So it literally just means thoughts or words about God. And so we all have that. We all have a theology about God, from the most hardcore atheist, who their theology of God is just, there is no God, to the most devoted follower of Jesus. We all have a theology. How accurate is that theology? And when it's wrong, when our theology is, when our view of God is wrong, we have a hard time understanding the goodness of who he is and understanding the goodness of his commands. It taints everything about us. It taints everything in this world, how we experience life. And today, as we go back to the Gospel of Mark, there's another confrontation with Jesus. And today, I think it stems from their tainted view of God, specifically when it comes to the Sabbath. We'll start in Mark 2:23. I'll read it. It says, on the Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and his disciples began to make their way, picking some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? He said to them, have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to his companions. Then he told them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So then, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Jesus entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a shriveled hand. In order to accuse him, they were watching him closely to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. He told the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand before us." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. After looking around at them with anger, he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts, and told the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Immediately, the Pharisees went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him, how they might kill him. Today, in this passage, we'll look at their problem with the Sabbath, the point of the Sabbath, and the Lord of the Sabbath. First, their problem with the Sabbath. What's their problem? Like, what are they upset about? What's Jesus and his disciples doing wrong? It says they just went through the grain fields and they made their way and they were picking some heads of grain. But the Pharisees are like, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" In their eyes, it's twofold. One, they're traveling. They're walking more than the 1,999 paces, which was okay, but beyond that, you're traveling. And they thought that the disciples were reaping grain. And there wasn't anything with reaping in itself. Deuteronomy would say, "When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck heads of grain with your hand, but do not put a sickle to your neighbor's grain." So you were allowed to, if you're walking through a field, you were allowed to pluck some grain to eat, but you weren't allowed to actually harvest it using a sickle, which was just a harvesting tool. So you could eat some, but just don't bring enough to bring home with you. For any of you that try to get a to-go box at the buffet, I'm not judging. I try to do the same thing, but same idea. It's like that's not how this works. And so it wasn't that. But it was in Exodus, it said, "You are to labor 6 days, but you must rest on the seventh day. You must even rest during plowing and harvesting time." So they're accusing Jesus and his disciples of not just plucking a little bit of grain, but that they're working, they're harvesting on the Sabbath. Even though they weren't actually reaping, like using a tool to harvest, they were just grabbing a snack. But the Pharisees accused Jesus and his disciples of doing what is, quote, "not lawful on the Sabbath." So first, they pick a fight with him about reaping grain. Second, they do it with this episode of healing. So this man comes into the synagogue with a shriveled hand. And in order to accuse him, they're watching him closely. And to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath or not. And so after looking around at them with anger and grieved at their hardness of hearts, he says, "Hey, stretch out your hand." And he restores it. So the Pharisees are trying to trap Jesus. This is the, fifth of many. They're I think the fifth confrontation they've had with Jesus in the last few chapters. And Jesus was so angry and grieved at their hardness of hearts around the Sabbath. I mean, think about it. Here is a man physically suffering, has this shriveled hand. And the Pharisees are more committed to their traditions than to relieving this man's physical suffering. Jesus is saying, "Guys, you're missing the point. Your hearts are hard. You're turning what God meant for good for evil." They weren't using these commands and these extra commands that they had built, these traditions to love their neighbor, but actually just the opposite. They would rather see this man physically suffer than break their tradition. But not Jesus. So he heals him. He restores his hand. And I imagine this guy with the shriveled hand has no idea of the conflict that he just walked into. He's just like, "I just was looking for somebody to help me with my hand, and I just kind of walked into a really awkward situation. It seems like maybe you guys got something you got to figure out here. I'm just trying to get my hand restored." You know, when you walk into a room and they obviously were just arguing, and you just walked in the middle of an argument, and they're like, "No, we're fine." But so he just walks in, no idea of this larger situation. Dude's just looking for some help with his shriveled hand. But despite doing good for this man, the Pharisees they accused Jesus of breaking the law. And they would always be adding on these extra rules to the law. The Pharisees would go above and beyond and add these extra requirements because the Sabbath command itself didn't actually have that many like precise extra details about how to fulfill it. It was just, cease work, don't work, rest, keep this day special or other or holy. And but they would add on all these really extra requirements. One Rabbi Shammai, opposed praying for or visiting the sick on the Sabbath because it was supposed to be a day of joy, not grieving. So they would add all these, heap on all these great burdens. And like Matthew 23 says, they tie up, about the Pharisees, they tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry and put them on people's shoulders. But they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger to move them. So Jesus heals this man that was physically suffering. And then immediately the Pharisees went out. This is their response to Jesus doing good. They went out and started plotting with the Herodians against him how they might kill him. And again, this is not just the result of one incident. This is many incidents and conflicts that have built up over the first few chapters. And what's fascinating is, we might read right over this, but the Herodians were supporters of King Herod, who was one of the most brutal kings who ruled Israel. And when Romans would conquer a country, they would set up rulers to try to force their culture on a place, like their Greco-Roman culture. So they'd try to have people assimilate to their culture. And the Pharisees were the total opposite. They were the ones trying to resist the culture. They were the traditionalists, that were so hesitant of any culture, and they were kind of the gatekeepers. But both parties are so upset at Jesus doing good that they were enemies, and now they decide to work together to plot to kill Jesus. When we think of Pharisees, we think of just kind of terrible people. The Pharisees, we read it and just that's kind of our first instinct. And it's kind of self-evident, the Pharisees. But it's likely that in that day, there was a lot of respect for the Pharisees. They were so committed to the Bible or Torah. They were more committed than anyone else. They were such a respected group they were just so hardcore about their beliefs and traditions. And so but their problem wasn't the desire to maintain the purity of truth. Their problem was that they just cared about externals, while their hearts remained wicked. They would heap these things on others and not lift a finger themselves. And all that mattered was their traditions, how things looked on the outside. Heart change, doesn't really matter. Oh man, we're going to clean the outside of that cup so good. And we see this today, I think, on probably both sides nowadays, where maybe you have, you think of maybe more like a really fundamentalist type of group, where they'd be the ones kind of squirming at Jesus dining with sinners. They think Jesus, said, they will know you by your opinions. That kind of church culture. That's one side. But then the other side is becoming so moralistically pharisaical too. So we're just so prone to fall into this hyper judgment, exterior motivated church culture or political culture, while all the time, at the same time, giving no thought or desire to actually changing our own hearts. I had a friend, a cousin once, that I've fallen into this trap of Pharisee, and so much so that I had a friend once, a cousin, that literally gave me a book called Pharisectomy, and that's not a joke. A little passive aggressive, if you ask me, but he gave me this book called Pharisectomy. And did I read it? No, I'm not going to read books with that ungodly sort of language, Pharisectomy. Sorry, there's my Pharisee coming out. But he gave me this book because we're so prone to fall in to this hyper judgment, gatekeeper type of mentality where, it doesn't matter. I don't care at all about my own heart change, but I care about everybody else and what they're doing. And I want to make sure that I'm maintaining truth for them. All the while, I'm not actually growing into the image of Christ. And so there were these types of people picking problems with Jesus because they thought, like many of us today, we're the gatekeepers. So they accused Jesus of not being obedient enough to the Bible. And they had turned a command and an invitation of God into a weapon. It's this self-justification where they're taking God's commands and they're using it to elevate themselves in order to justify themselves. And I don't know anybody else, when I was a young Christian, like I just wanted to be the most hardcore Christian, like hyper spiritual, sort of, have some gotcha moments with other Christians. And there really is such a huge spirit of that in the church today. Like, I don't know if you spend any time on the Christian internet. It's the normal internet, but like where the Christians hang out and post Christian stuff. But like we build platforms on trying to catch people saying the wrong thing. Like it's kind of this, we're in this now cancel culture, and this Pharisee was like the first century cancel culture. And certainly, there's time for us to rebuke and correct and call out false teachers, all of that for sure. But if that's all we ever do, then that might be a signal that, like us, like the Pharisees, we're actually just missing the point because we're so hyper fixated on everybody else. They don't give enough money. They don't listen to the right teachers. They don't use the right Bible translation. Can you believe they read the Bible on their cell phone? Those heathens. Why do we do that? Why do we fall so prone into that judgment? To justify ourselves, to think, man, at least I'm better than that church or that other Christian or that person. And I'm just saying, if we, like the Pharisees, are trying to be more spiritual than Jesus, we might want to tone it down a bit, or at least not demand that others follow suit, adding on all these other traditions or extra biblical commands. So that was their problem with the Sabbath. But what was the point of the Sabbath? This is what I wanted to drill into a little bit. What is the Sabbath? Real quick. It's the word that means to cease or to stop. In Genesis, God had created the world and he rested on the seventh day. He completed his work that he had done. He rested from all his work that he had done. God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, for on it he rested from all his work of creation. Not a ton of specifics. You're told to observe it as holy, as unique, separate, something that's restful for you might not be restful for me, or vice versa. So there's an inherent freedom, like God's laying a gift at our feet. Something that may be restful for one person might not be restful for another. There's Eugene Peterson talked about Sabbath as being twofold: praying and playing. And so he was a pastor, and he and his wife, they would, like every Monday, he'd take his Sabbath and they would go hike together, like a new trail, go hiking together, and then break for lunch and have lunch together and everything. To me, that sounds like heaven on earth. For you, it might sound like torture, like you might not be into hiking. And not he was spending time with his spouse. Hopefully that's not the part that sounds like torture for you. But the hiking part, you know what I mean? But the point is, the Sabbath was a gift, supposed to be life-giving, a command that leads to joy, that leads to health, that leads to rest. And Jesus argues using this Old Testament example to prove his point. This scene of David in 1 Samuel 21. I don't have the slides. I'll just do an overview real quick. But David goes to the priest and basically asks for food. Like he and the other guys are hungry. He says, the king gave me a mission, but he told me, don't let anyone know anything about the mission I'm sending you on or what I have ordered you to do. So I stationed my young men at a certain place. Then he asked, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever can be found. And the priest told him, there is no ordinary bread on hand, but there is consecrated bread. But the young men may only eat it if they have kept themselves from women. So David answers, I swear the women are being kept from us. It sounds like some of us in high school. But as always when I go out to battle, the young men's bodies are consecrated. So just to be real brief about it, basically he's asking for bread for him and the other soldiers because they're hungry. And the priest says, well, we don't have any just like normal bread, but we do have consecrated bread. So the priest gives them this consecrated bread, for there was no bread except the bread of the presence. And so he gives them bread, but not normal bread that technically they weren't supposed to eat. This is just for the temple. And so Jesus uses that Old Testament example that the Pharisees would have been so devoted to and says, hey, even King David ate consecrated bread, which technically he probably wasn't supposed to. And Jesus is a good debater, right? Can we agree on that? He justifies his and the disciples' actions by referencing the book that the Pharisees are so committed to, and they're still just trying to trap him. But he summarizes in verse 17. So he gives this example, Old Testament example, to justify his actions, and he says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. Meaning the Sabbath was there to serve them. We weren't created to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was supposed to remove burdens, and instead they are using it as a means to pile on more burdens. One commentator, William Lane, says the divine intention was in no way infringed by the plucking of heads of grain on the part of Jesus' disciples. They were missing the divine intention of God. Did you know that none of the commands in the Bible are there to make you miserable? They're not there to make you miserable. I spent a lot of my young years thinking they were, not realizing that it's the Creator God, the Father, that gives us these commands as guardrails to joy, guardrails to living a compelling, beautiful, healthy, joyful life. But they're missing the divine intention of God. You know, it's like, anybody have any friends that are bodybuilders? Like, I had a friend that was a really hardcore bodybuilder, and I admired, the discipline it took, right? You don't just become a body, you don't just become ripped by not working hard. But I was also like, it kind of seems like you're missing the point about exercise. Isn't exercise to just maintain a healthy life? But meanwhile, you're so jacked that you can barely lift your arm up over your head. It doesn't seem very functional in real life. In the gym, yeah, you're the man. But in normal life, it seems like you're kind of missing the point. Or a sadder example is, they're getting mad at Jesus for doing it on the Sabbath. And it's like, any of you that have young kids, we get up early, get the coffee ready, maybe French press, AeroPress, I don't know what you do, but we get the coffee ready, and then we go sit in our favorite spot just to open the Bible, because we're going to spend this time with God, and we're going to read His Word, and we're going to be like, oh yeah, love your neighbors yourself, that's so good. Welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you. Yeah, I need to do that. God, give me the desire in the heart to do that. And then you hear the little footsteps trickling down the stairs. And in one moment, you're in this blissful time with God, talking about how you're going to love people better. And then people literally come down the stairs. And now I'm upset. Here I am wanting to spend time with God and love God so I can love others, all the while being unloving to my precious little 2-year-old boy who's excited to see his dad. We miss the point. It's times like that when I hear God whispering, Dan, I admire your devotion, but you're becoming so rigid about your time with God that you're failing to love the people that God sends your way. So the Pharisees, like us, just making it about the rules, about the discipline, missing the heart of God, giving us a gift. For them, rules aren't a means to an end. The rules are the end. They make it about the rules. The Sabbath was to bring rest and joy, and to them it's causing this anxiety. And why was Jesus so angry? That commentator William Lane says, in their concern for legal detail, they had forgotten the mercy and grace shown by God to man when he had made provision for the Sabbath. God offers a gift, a command, but one that's a gift. And we're always twisting and perverting those gifts by making them either so rigid, or we're perverting them by making the lines so nonchalant, like anything goes, where we just totally ignore his boundaries. I think a lot of us, though, we pervert his gifts by making them so rigid. And they're insensitive to God's heart for this suffering man. Tim Keller says in his book, Jesus is King, he says, because the Sabbath is about restoring the diminished, it's about replenishing the drained, it's about repairing the broken. To heal a man's shriveled hand is to do exactly what the Sabbath is all about. In other words, they're missing the forest for the trees. They're missing the forest for the trees. Our 2-year-old, Emmett, he has this habit of storing food in his cheek, and like a chipmunk. And so we're laying in bed, like I'm putting him to bed, and a couple nights in a row he says, "Daddy, can we eat in bed?" And I'm like, "No, buddy, we're not going to eat in bed. We just ate dinner." And so I'm just thinking like he wants to bring snacks in bed or whatever. Like that was random, but he says a lot of random stuff. And but then it happens again. I'm like, "No, we can't. We're not going to eat in bed. Why do you keep asking that?" And then like a couple days later, Taylor goes, "Emmett's cheek is all swollen." I'm like, "That's weird. What is that?" And then I was like, "Oh my gosh." That's what he was talking about. He was talking about, "Dad, can I chew this food that's in my mouth right now while I'm in bed?" And I'm thinking, we're not going to bring a bunch of snacks in bed. And I'm like, I'm like, "Thank you for your obedience, but that's not what I meant. That was not the heart of my rule, But for the religious leaders, obedience is this burden. They make it about the rule, missing the heart of God. And for Jesus, obedience is a delight. A delight. 1 John 5 says this, "For this is what love for God is, to keep his commands," and get this, "and his commands are not a burden." Because everyone who has been born of God conquers the world. This is the victory that has conquered the world, our faith. His commands are not a burden? How can you write that? How can you write that? It depends on our view of God. As we started, are these just arbitrary things that we can't eat in bed? Are these just arbitrary rules? Or are his commands, do they stem from his heart for humanity? I think maybe the older, I'm going to broad stroke generalize here, so sorry, but the older generation, I would say, generally speaking, please don't hate me, would say this: feelings don't matter, just obey. I would say my generation, and that younger than us, would say obedience doesn't matter. What matters is how I feel. Is that fair? I think actually both are wrong. I think neither are correct. I think biblical obedience is actually in between those two, where you can because you can obey God externally, but your heart and motive still be wicked. That was Jesus' problem with the Pharisees. Or you can feel good about your relationship with God and never do anything. Like those are the two extremes. But Jesus says in Matthew 15, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines human commands." They're externally, they look like they're obeying. But Jesus is saying that's actually not biblical obedience, because their hearts are still far from me. The goal of following Jesus is not heartless, external-only obedience. The goal is joyful, heartfelt obedience, not an either or, but a both and. I think the main problem and the reason Jesus was so angry and grieved because these men simply could not accept the tokens of God's goodness to mankind. So they and we so often miss the point of God's commands because we miss the heart of God himself. Lastly, and we'll try to be brief, the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus says, "So then the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." He's claiming, not only am I the Son of Man, but I am the Lord, Lord of the Sabbath. He's saying the Sabbath, this idea, this rule, it was my idea. Here you are trying to destroy the Son of God who stands right in front of your face. And Jesus is saying, you're missing the point. I am the Son of God. I am the Lord of the Sabbath. But it all depends on our view of God and their view of God. What is your view of God? Is he gracious? Are his commands for us, for our good? Or is he this tyrant in the sky sort of being? Walk on eggshells, try not to make him too mad. Their view of God did not allow for God's commands to be good. They couldn't get themselves to believe that God was actually for their joy, and that's so true of so many of us Christians. We just cannot, like Jesus would be getting grieved in his heart at us because we just cannot accept the tokens of God's goodness for us. We can't rejoice in the good gifts of him. We view him as kind of cold, heartless, stoic. We call him Lord, but we're uncomfortable calling him Father. We resist verses that talk about him giving good gifts. And we're skeptical of anyone who talks about experiencing the love of God. You know, you ever been around those people? If you're like, man, God's just so loving. Yeah, but he's holy. You're like, before you can even get it out of your mouth, you're like corrected. And you're like, no duh, Sherlock, holiness and love can go together. They do go together. But many of us in this room, we just struggle with this idea of God giving good gifts. That Jesus is not only Lord of the Sabbath, but Lord of our lives. And that he's King of our lives, but that he's a good king. That he's a good king. You know, how many of us struggle to believe that God actually doesn't just love us, but likes us? You ever thought about that? Does he like us? What if he delights in you? Does God delight in you? Well, what if you actually believe that? When's the last time you sensed God's good pleasure for you? The question is not if God is pleased with you, it's is he pleased with Christ? Is he pleased with the Lord of the Sabbath? And as long as God is pleased with Christ, which I think he is, then you can trust that he's pleased with you because Paul says in the language of Paul, you are hidden in Christ. And God's law was a way for Israel to love God and love others, and now they use it to justify not loving others because their view of God. Jesus puts him, so when he uses that example of King David, Jesus is putting himself on par with King David. When David was, he's referencing when David was anointed, but not enthroned. And implying that Jesus is the true king. He was anointed as a baptism, but not fully enthroned, at least earthly speaking. He'd have to go to the cross first, but they just are totally missing it. That he's the real king, that he's the real Lord, and he's a king who offers us rest and freedom, not unnecessary heaping on more and more burdens. In Colossians 2, Paul says, therefore, don't let anyone judge you in regard to food and drink or in matter of a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of what was to come. The substance is Christ. Meaning all these things, these traditions, these commands are supposed to point us to the King, to the substance, which is Christ. And for followers of Jesus, it's not that God's commands aren't still binding on us or that it's like a free-for-all or something. It's just that we can see that they're actually the pathway to lead us to life. If you think about it, sin is what's burdensome, not God's commands. What jacks up your life worse, following God's commands or sin? Sin is what's burdensome. N.T. Wright said about the Sabbath, it wasn't an odd moral commandment which people observed to earn merit or favor with God. It was a sign that they belonged to the one true God, the creator of the world, who had himself rested on the seventh day. It wasn't a way to earn God's favor. It was a way to realize the substance, which is Christ, to lead us to see him as king in our lives. And they're just so focused on the rules of the Sabbath that they're missing the point of the Sabbath, and they're missing the person, the Lord of the Sabbath. So if we have a right view of God, then obedience to his commands are not only possible, but enjoyable. Enjoyable. But you can't get there if your view of God is wrong. You'll just become more pharisaical, more hardcore, more judgmental. And it doesn't mean that there won't be times, I think, when you're just not feeling it and you obey anyways. I'm just saying that's not the goal. That's not the goal. The goal is joyful obedience from a loving Father, then you trust in the character and grace and mercy of God. And so you obey. And we don't weaponize God's commands. We're not out waiting to catch people, aha, gotcha. Those Pharisees, think about it, they actually weren't resting either. They were out playing Sabbath police or whatever, like so intensely focused trying to catch Jesus that they're missing the point of resting. They're not following the Sabbath either. And instead of keeping our eyes on everyone else, focused on what they're doing wrong, we can keep our eyes fixed on the Lord of the Sabbath. And that all these commands, all these laws are summed up in loving others and loving God himself. And the Sabbath isn't just an invitation, and the Sabbath is just actually an invitation for a foretaste of the full rest that would come. It's like an appetizer to the main meal. The writer of Hebrews says, let us then make every effort to enter that rest, this eternal rest, so that no one will fall into the same pattern of disobedience. That there's effort involved, but there's rest. The goal, the offer is rest. That God is good and generous and loving enough not only to offer us a day per week of loving soul level rest, but to invite us into an eternity of joyful, loving, playful rest with God himself. Worship team, you can come back up. So in conclusion, what we believe God is like will infiltrate how we view his commands. We will either gravitate toward external only religion, viewing them as a sort of straitjacket of duty, or we can view God's gifts as guardrails to delight. That he knows what he's doing. He knows what he's talking about. That none of his commands are to make our life miserable. And Jesus came not just to get us to heartlessly obey God, but to give us new hearts that grow into and be transformed into desiring to obey God. That we actually want to. That it's not just a duty, it becomes a delight, but it all starts with who we believe God to be. What we think he is like. Would you pray with me as we close? Father, we just come before you this morning. We all have views of you, some more accurate than others. None of us have a perfect view of you. But we just pray that you would correct our understanding of who you are, that we would see your character for what it truly is. That yes, you are holy, but yes, you are loving and gracious and gentle and good, and that you give us good gifts. God, may you continue to transform our hearts to be followers of you that don't just clean the outside of the cup, but that are being renewed inside as well. We pray all these things in your name. Amen.